Thank you for sticking around when it's after 4 o'clock on a Friday afternoon, and I know that some of you have got long journeys home. My name's Dougald. I'm from a startup called School of Everything. We're a very small organisation. There's all of 7 of us, and our designer's on holiday this week, so I've had to do my own PowerPoint. So it's not going to be up to the standard of some of the fantastic presentations that we've had already this afternoon. I'm not going to talk too much about School of Everything itself. To give you the very brief summary, we're interested in giving people tools to organise their own education. We run something which has been called an eBay for learning. It's a kind of place where you can find somebody near you who wants to teach something that you want to learn, or who wants to learn something that you could teach. And we've developed that with investment from Channel 4 and from the Young Foundation, which carries on the work of the guy who founded the Open University, Michael Young. And if you're interested in that, you can see more at schoolofeverything.com. But what I wanted to talk about was actually something which has come up in a couple of presentations earlier on this afternoon. This Demos project, the Edgeless University, which was funded by JISC, which happened earlier this year. I was quite involved in that. I think I was kind of there as the hired troublemaker, the outsider to the process. And I think my main contribution when I read the final report, which Pete Bradwell wrote, which is well worth looking at if you haven't, was that after 2 hours of a sort of session with senior HE people, I turned around to Pete and said, that was like sitting with a group of record industry executives in 1999. And I'm probably preaching to the converted in many cases here today, but I thought this might be an interesting opportunity for me to try and think more about that reaction. And to think about if this is sort of to higher education and learning in general, a similar point to what 1999 was to the record industry. How might the relationship between education and technology play out over the next decade? Are we going to be in for the kind of events and the kind of ideological tussles that we've seen in the music industry in the last decade, and which are going on even now with Lily Allen claiming that she's retiring because piracy has jeopardized the music industry, and the Pirate Party UK setting up to contest the next general election. So the way that I started thinking about this was in terms of the non-obviousness of the things that are bundled together in the university. I haven't crowdsourced this. I should have sent out a survey this morning, shouldn't I? This was just me off the top of my head trying to think about some of the different products and services and experiences which are kind of packaged together in the university experience, primarily thinking about it from a student's point of view. And the reasons why those tend to belong together at the moment, and thinking about the extent to which social media might, over the next 10 years, facilitate a really dramatic unbundling of that package. And I'm not trying to make any predictions particularly. Really, what I'm going to go through here is speculation. It's just exploring one way in which that might play out. First of all, by thinking about how do technologies spread through society? What are the things which determine which technologies do spread and how they change the way that we do things in the world at large? And then looking at some examples which have that flavor of kind of the bar camp, the places where people are experimenting with stuff that seems a bit fringe at the moment, but which might actually turn out to be the models for the way in which education develops. And then finally looking at some of the obstacles and the objections to this possible pathway that things might go down, and the ways in which some of the external pressures on institutions education might play into those obstacles. So my starting point for thinking about education when we started working on School of Everything is not taking it for granted that learning is something which only happens within institutions. It's something that's been said already this afternoon. I think it's important that we distinguish the future of educational institutions from the future of the things that we value education for, because otherwise we're going to miss how much learning is already going on outside of formal environments. And I think that was part of kind of why I got wound up in that seminar at Demos 6 months ago, because I thought we'd come together to talk about the edges of the university disappearing and these things going on all over the place. And it felt like a lot of the other people in the room were really there to talk about the future of their institutions as businesses, as public services, but in a way which didn't distinguish between the interests of those institutions and the interests of learners. I think it's important that we do that. Another thing for thinking about how technology spread, not everything that we come up with does get adopted. I mean, how many people in this room, put your hand up if you have made more than one video call from a mobile phone? And yet, 5 years ago, the mobile industry genuinely believed that that was going to be the big 3G technology. And I think it's important to remember, it's kind of humbling to remember that we get it wrong, that we're not actually that good at predicting which technologies are going to take off, and to think about why we get it wrong so that we can perhaps make better judgments whilst retaining that humility. SMS, on the other hand, was completely unanticipated as a mass impact technology. It wasn't something which there was lots of hype around. It was just something that people started using. And one of the most massive things in the history of telephone communications. Because often, I guess, people want less information, not more. And it's worth thinking about how that applies in terms of the discussion that's going to be going on a bit later about virtual worlds. Because I do wonder whether the enthusiasm for virtual worlds might parallel to some extent the enthusiasm for video calling on mobile phones, whether there might actually be a limit to how many people really want immersive, high information environments like that. The classic model for thinking about how technology spread through society, which can in some ways help us make sense of why something like video calling might not spread that far along the curve from the pioneers and the early adopters. It's also a really problematic model because it's completely loaded with value judgments. I mean, at one end, you've got the innovators or the pioneers in the original version of this. At the other end, you've got the laggards. Who wants to be a laggard? It's, as soon as you start looking at how technology spread with a model like this, you're already assuming that it would be a good thing for everybody to adopt the technology. So I think this way of thinking about the spread of technologies needs to be treated with care. But what it can do is suggest that there are genuinely different clusters of motivations which lead people to take up technologies, and that beyond that sort of first, the front tail of the diffusion of innovation curve, belief in technology as progress, belief in desire to have all of these devices that you can keep pulling out of your jacket like a kind of conjuring trick, that only goes down well with certain audiences. It doesn't spread that far through society, and that's not the fault of the people who fall into these other categories. We're not superior because we get excited about technology, and sometimes we have to be a bit careful about the way we talk and think about that. So this is sort of where I ended up with thinking about how do we think about what technologies are really going to change the way that education works? New technologies lead to social change when they're able to channel existing dissatisfactions and unmet desires beyond the desires of those of us who like new technologies. So if we're looking at what the future of technology and education is going to be like, actually it's as important to look at where the dissatisfactions and unmet desires are as it is to look at the gadgets and the new things that we can do. Because how far along that curve they're going to spread is largely dependent on how far they're going to meet these, and especially when the existing ways of doing things are coming under pressure. Because one of the classic features of the journey along the adoption curve is that people further down the curve are driven more by security and stability. And it's when that security and that stability is under pressure for other reasons that new technologies spread furthest. So with that in mind, there are a few kind of marginal but interesting projects that I've come across in the last year, or examples which I think illuminate the way in which the university might come unbundled, the ways in which people are already, not just as a result of enthusiasm and passion for technology, but as a result of responding to dissatisfactions and unmet desires within the way that their university experience has currently been offered to them, are organizing alternatives around the edges. So this was an example that I came across down the road from me in Hackney, an organization called Space Studios, which provide workspace and exhibition space for artists. They were approached by a group of young women who had, some of them had dropped out of MA courses in media arts, and some of them had looked at these courses and decided that they weren't that happy with what was on offer. And there were two things that were kind of coming particularly to the fore in terms of dissatisfaction. One was the facilities in the university departments that they were looking at just were not up to date. They were not up to the standard in the industry. And the other thing was just a sense that the value for money in terms of the time and the resources they were going to get for what they were paying for what were going to be self-funded taught postgrad courses wasn't that great. And so they approached Space and said, can we come in a couple of evenings a week and use the equipment that you have, which your artists in residence and the people who you're doing workshops for in the daytime use. And so they've been organizing now for about 6 months their own alternative to a master's course in media arts. And there are sort of 3 layers to it. They have public events, which they have in the pub, where anyone can come along to a themed discussion. They have peer learning events where they come in and use the space. And then when they figure out between them that there's something that they need training in, they get people from working artists and people from within the industries that overlap with media arts to come in and do workshops for them. And they're starting to work with Space now to try and get some funding for that. But initially, they've done it basically self-organized and using the slack space and the slack time in the resources that were already there at Space. This is another example that kind of came to me through School of Everything on this occasion. A girl called Pippa Buchanan, who's organizing what she calls a DIY Masters, and using tools like School of Everything to find people who are prepared to give her a bit of their time and some direction and some teaching, and documenting it as she goes along and looking to connect with other people who are thinking on similar lines. So I'm interested in whether we're going to see a kind of a growth of that, and whether, in the same way as blogging started with a handful of people creating their own sites, whether you're going to get people building tools, and whether something like School of Everything might evolve into a tool which, in the same way as Blogger facilitates blogging, which facilitates this kind of self-organized alternative to higher education. This is a completely different example that came through School of Everything. This is from an email exchange which I had with a PhD student who got in touch with us to let us know that he had ended up organizing these maths lessons and this maths course for himself through our site. He's in a geography department. His PhD has a lot of economics in it, and he realized about halfway through that his maths wasn't good enough. He needed to understand better the maths of the economic models that he was working with, and he just hit a brick wall in terms of trying to find what he needed from within the university. And what interests me there is that I'm certain that the resources in terms of the people with the knowledge and the skills were there within the university. But there's clearly some problem with the indexing of that knowledge. One of the things that when we were emailing backwards and forwards, he was talking about was the frustration with the sense of the way in which departments are full of people who want you to kind of continue in the same furrow that they've been in and don't really understand if what you need is from a completely different part of the university. And that was his experience. So it's partly an indexing problem, but it's partly a motivation problem as well, because he's talked about having sent this email that had gone out to the postgrad students in 2 economics departments, offering to pay for someone to kind of tutor him in what he needed and getting no response. So one of the things that seems to be characteristic of some of these self-organized marginal examples that I've been looking at is greater motivation. I mean, see the enthusiasm. If you go to a bar camp and see people coming along on a weekend to teach each other things that they've been learning, whether in their university departments or in their professional practice, how often is that level of kind of morale and enthusiasm and motivation there in the experience of students within university, and how often do they not quite encounter that level for reasons which are not necessarily the fault of the people teaching them? This is kind of a different example. Somebody I was talking to 2 days ago, Anne-Marie McEwen, who runs the Smart Work company. She teaches in a business school, and she also teaches through her company, the Smart Work company, and she's teaching master's equivalent courses tailored for business people who are coming to her through that channel rather than through the MBA program that she also teaches on. And I'm interested in the extent, and it was quite clear talking to her that she found it less frustrating to teach through this channel than working with the university. And as it gets easier for people to organize their own teaching practices like this, are we going to see more of that? And then a final example, this is the most informal end. This is one of the thousands of meetup groups that go on, that meet up every week or every month around the UK. There's one called Ulcc Futures, which is set up by a group of, they call themselves design futurists. And they borrow space after hours in the office of a company where one of them works. It was set up by a guy, James King, who has also taught at Central St Martin's on the design courses there. And they get people who are kind of straight out of or still at university coming along to this. And they also get people like Matt Jones, who's one of the kind of legends of sort of web design in the UK, coming along to it. And what you've got there is an incredibly light, cheap to organize community of learning where they are organizing really high quality seminars effectively on a regular basis. And it's just a lot easier now than it was a few years ago to organize these kinds of things and also to find out about these kinds of things. And I'm really curious about the way in which that starts to unlock some of the dissatisfactions and the unmet desires for the things which the university has been a major provider of, but which the university doesn't necessarily have a monopoly on being able to provide. Now, just in terms of obstacles and objections, one thing that came up again in that Demos seminar was a sense that the people who were the enthusiasts for technology and education were getting it wrong because they thought that education was all about delivering content, and it was the kind of the banking model of education. And that the reason why the university was going to kind of survive in pretty much its present form and why this education technology stuff was a bit hyped was because actually it's about relationships, it's about people. And what the people who were arguing that really didn't seem to understand is that more and more the way that the web has gone in the last few years is not just about scaling up and the economies of scale, the fact that you can get better quality lectures through iTunes U than you can probably get if you actually get out of bed and go to your 9 o'clock lecture. But the web is also increasingly about scaling down, about it being easier to organize things on a more human scale, more informally, and that you can probably, as well as getting a kind of better quality lecture through iTunes U, you can potentially start to organize a more satisfying seminar or study group through Meetup or through School of Everything. And I think that's, there is a risk that some of those things from the bundle of what we think of the university doing and providing, some of them go upwards and some of them go downwards, and what's left in the middle for the university could be, for some institutions, a crisis. Another objection or obstacle, qualifications and accreditation. You might not have the most satisfying time on your master's course, and you might not feel that you're getting very good value for money in terms of the hours of contact time that you get for however many £1,000 you pay for it, but you do get a piece of paper at the end which says that you've done it, which you can add as a line onto your CV. And this is a question for most of the projects that I've used as examples there that they are thinking about is, how do you represent what you're learning in these informal, self-organized environments? But I think it's also a question for formal education too, because I think that this stuff could drive a rethinking of qualifications from first principles. Because what are qualifications about? It's basically a way of making the evidence of what you've achieved and your skills and the reputation that goes with that portable, so that you can present a degree certificate that has come from one place in another place and have it treated as valid currency. So in other words, it's a very old-fashioned information technology. And I think that a lot of the work that has gone on qualifications and on sort of new innovation in qualifications in the last sort of 10 or 20 years hasn't gone back to first principles about that anywhere near enough. And I think that that's one place where social media and the ways of doing things online could really challenge educational institutions. Because employers already know that a degree certificate is not the most useful piece of information that you get about a candidate. Employers are already Googling people's names when they go through CVs and looking at people's online lives. And I'm interested in the possibility that we evolve ways of representing the information that we have thought of qualifications as being the best way of doing quite differently, and that those become more valuable currencies in the employment market. And obviously, education isn't all about employability, but that's often where the qualifications side of things comes in. And one thought that I had in relation to that, I came across a Scottish fiddle teacher. We have a lot of music teachers on School of Everything, who had on his website a kind of family tree of the person who taught him and the person who'd taught him and the person who taught him all the way back to the 18th century. And this is something which in various different kind of communities of work and communities of practice there's a long history of. Crafts genealogies, who you were apprenticed to within many crafts traditions is a very important piece of information. And perhaps the ability to kind of map our social connections more visibly will bring that back into play as a more useful piece of information than just the name of the institution, or the kind of which of the 4 denominations of degree note you got is. Final obstacle, objection, question, facilities and equipment. There's been a discussion going on which was started by David Jennings on his blog, which is at alchemy.co.uk, about the idea of these new, light, more self-organized models of education coming into their own in the era of progressive austerity, as he calls it, which we're heading into as a result of the consequences of public spending, apart from anything else of what's happened in the last year or two. And one of the challenges that was put to him was that he was underestimating the need for expensive resources in terms of the facilities that universities provide for teaching and learning. But I kind of wonder about turning that the other way around and whether there isn't already a challenge which is demonstrated by something like the Ulcc project at Space Studios, and something that I experienced as a broadcast journalism student nearly 10 years ago, where the equipment that you have in the university is not up to date and can't keep up to date with the equipment that you're going to be expected to use when you go into the workplace. And at the same time, there's data that shows workplaces are used at only 10% of their capacity if viewed over 24 hours, and only 40 to 50% of their capacity if viewed over the 8 hours of the peak working day. Obviously, that applies more in some industries than others, but I think that there could be a coming together of making use of slack space and slack time in workplaces as a way of getting access to the things that people are actually using in these industries, rather than something that's 3 years out of date, which is a long time in graphic design or broadcasting or whatever. So whether we're going to be able to sort of self-organize between workplaces and people organizing learning outside of institutions is another interesting question that comes up here. So what might unbundled universities end up looking like? It's important, the other side of making the distinction between learning or education as a social good and the educational institutions we have is that people are not going to stop learning. People were learning before we had universities, and people could be learning after we have universities. I'm not really suggesting that the university is going to disappear over the next 10 years, but I think that smart institutions are going to recognize that the environment is going to be more diverse, that you might specialize, you might provide the accreditation and let people organize their own teaching. That's how we do driving. You don't have to pay your driving examiner to give you driving lessons. It's already thoroughly unbundled in an area like that. The same thing applies for how music lessons and the associated board work. So are we going to see some institutions specializing, or at least offering those kinds of unbundled services? And generally, I think it could be a hopeful thing to have an environment in which the university was more aware of not having a monopoly on higher learning and on the social goods, which it is very important for the way that it provides. And so I think there could be a really hopeful ecology. And as Pete says in the Demos pamphlet, technology did undermine certain business models that sustained the music industry, but the threat wasn't to music itself, only to the way that the current business models worked. New ways of creating and finding music had been made possible, and the same, I'm certain, will apply to education.
Right.